Welcome to this e-GRO plant diagnostic video. Hi, I'm Brian Whipker, Professor of Floriculture at North Carolina State University. In this video, we will discuss sulfur deficiency of poinsettias. So let's get started. First of all, I'd like to thank the Fred C. Glockner Foundation for supporting this project. Sulfur. Sulfur is an oftentimes forgotten element. Many times it's already provided by the irrigation water or via air pollution. Sulfur can also be provided as part of the fertilizer charge in the substrate or through supplemental fertilizations. While sulfur deficiencies are infrequent, incidents have occurred in the last few years. In this video, we're going to make you aware of the disorder, identification of deficiency symptoms, and management strategies. So what does sulfur deficiency look like? Sulfur deficiency is an overall yellowing of the top of the foliage first, and many times the lower foliage will remain green. Sulfur is an often overlooked element when it comes to plant nutrition. The sulfur content is not listed on most fertilizer bags. Substrate and tissue recommended ranges for sulfur do not exist for most crops. It is often considered a Me Too element because historically adequate levels have been provided via air pollution. Sulfur deficiencies are rare, but I'm surprised it does not appear more often than it does, especially as the electrical generation of power has changed from high sulfur coal to low sulfur coal. So what do deficiencies look like? Sulfur deficiencies appear as an overall yellowing or chlorosis of the top foliage. You can also see here that the lower foliage is quite green. You can also see that it's an overall chlorosis. That is, that the top foliage is pretty well pale green or slightly yellow. And finally, look at the lower foliage. You can see that it's darker green, and that is typical of what occurs with sulfur deficiency. So based on where the symptoms appear will help you identify the problem. So sulfur and iron deficiencies occur on the upper foliage, whereas nitrogen deficiencies or low EC cause deficiencies occur on the lower foliage. And we'll look at the next few slides to help differentiate among these three deficiencies. For sulfur deficiency, the best idea is to conduct a substrate test and/or a tissue test to help confirm your diagnosis. On the other hand, iron deficiencies induced by high substrate pH initially appear as an interveinal chlorosis. Basically, the veins remain green and the area between the veins turn yellow. With advanced conditions, the plants may develop an overall yellow coloration very similar to sulfur deficiency. To help confirm the diagnosis of an iron deficiency, that can be done by conducting a soil test. Typically, the substrate pH would be above 6.5. For nitrogen deficiency, an overall yellowing occurs at the bottom of the foliage first. As symptoms become more severe, it can move up the plant and the leaves typically fall off over time. To help confirm your diagnosis, either take a substrate sample to look at the nitrogen and EC levels, and/or take a tissue sample to look at nitrogen content in those leaves. When looking at sulfur deficiency, the grower that I was working with asked how come it's occurring now. To answer that question, one needs to look at the source of the sulfur. Supplemental calcium and magnesium applications are typically provided to poinsettias. CalMag formulations are an excellent choice. To avoid the risk of precipitation in the fertilizer tank, magnesium comes from a source of magnesium nitrate and not magnesium sulfate. Therefore, little if any additional sulfur is supplied by the fertilizer. So with the grower, the problem was relying upon a CalMag formulation to provide their magnesium. So after 4 to 6 weeks of growth, the sulfur availability from the substrate basically ran out. So with no additional sulfur being provided, we did then see sulfur deficiency occurring. So the question comes up, how do you avoid sulfur deficiencies? Well, first of all, it probably is a good idea to take a water test to determine if there is sufficient sulfur in your water supply. If there's not, it's a good idea to make monthly applications of magnesium sulfate. To do this, mix 1 pound of magnesium sulfate per 100 gallons of water and drench the pots with a 10 to 20% leaching fraction. In addition, it's a good idea to conduct periodic substrate tests. So if you do have a sulfur deficiency, how do you overcome that? To do that, we also would use magnesium sulfate. Mix 2 pounds per 100 gallons of water and apply it as a drench to the pots with a 10 to 20% leaching fraction. As a side note, for the majority of the plants in these photographs, they greened up within 2 weeks after corrective application of magnesium sulfate was applied. In summary, the sulfur requirements of plants are often overlooked. One needs to target around 50 to 100 parts per million sulfur in the substrate in order to grow the plants. If your irrigation water contains insufficient levels of sulfur, consider making monthly supplemental applications of magnesium sulfate to avoid problems.